the floor of the House of Representatives or in the United States Senate. And with that, Madam Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back the balance of the time. Under the Speaker's announced policies of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, is recognized for 40 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before my colleague Dan Burton leaves the chamber, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful reflections here. I should tell the Speaker, as well as everyone who might be watching, that we were teasing you a moment ago because you said you were only going to speak for 10 minutes. And I said, Dan Burton, you've never spoken for 10 minutes in your life. You're going to go a lot longer than that, but you held it to about 10. Your words were not only precise, but they were deeply thoughtful and meaningful. And I think they're an outstanding tribute to you in leaving this body. And I want to thank you for your personal friendship to me, for your words of admonition to the rest of us to try to be a little kinder, a little bit gentler. I think it's important for people to know, and you alluded to it, that over a decade ago your own wife died. The caregiver for your wife, as she had cancer, was a person, Samia, who became your friend, became friends of your family, and your own children encouraged you to perhaps pursue a relationship with her. And now she is your lovely wife, and it's been a pleasure to see you so happy in these last years of public service, but we really appreciate your dedication and passion to serving this nation, so thank you so much. Madam Speaker, I'd like to turn to another topic now. I sat in my office last night looking at the pictures of the precious little children who were killed in Connecticut last Friday. What can you say? My heart breaks for them and their parents and the people of Newtown. I looked at the picture of little Caroline Previti, one of the 6-year-old children who died. I'm sure she was a happy child, full of life's potential, just like my own little Caroline, who just turned 7 a few days ago. What can you say? It's unthinkable that a person would kill innocent little children with such cravenness and violence. These children's Christmas presents are still under the tree. Their moms and dads are still looking at them. In this town, where we pride ourselves on rhetorical flourish, precision of thought, and volume of words, what can you say? What can you do other than stand in solidarity, in spirit with the grieving families, and perhaps, just perhaps, hug those that you love a little bit tighter? Now, Madam Speaker, the Sandy Hook Elementary School tragedy is sparking a national debate about how and why this happened and how it might have been prevented. That debate is understandable and needs to happen. In the coming weeks, Congress will be called on to react. Questions have already arisen about guns and school safety and emergency preparedness. But these concerns and debates may bypass altogether some of the deeper, more difficult issues involved, like what we grappled with after the tragic shootings of young people at Columbine High School and on the Virginia Tech campus. What we must do is to be honest. Yes, there were guns involved. Yes, there are issues of school safety. And yes, there was a collapse of mental health intervention. But I have not heard a significant discussion of the broader cultural context in which this and other tragedies have happened. All of these tragedies happened against a backdrop of a culture that increasingly devalues and degrades human life. Graphic acts of violence and inhumanity pervade popular culture, entertainment, and other venues that vie for our attention. Flipping through the channels recently, I saw on a Law and Order show, ironically, a man shot in an elevator with the blood splashing on his attorney. Seconds later, we move on to the next scene or the next commercial without consequence. We are supposedly entertained by this, and of course the producer gets the profit. But who really pays? Society grows increasingly numb to the increasing levels of wanton brutality and cruelty and indignity, all celebrated for profit. Perhaps most of us can shake it off or just turn it off, but what happens when a person of limited stability sees these images over and over again? We preach tolerance for one another, but fill our culture with grotesque, inhuman depictions and expect that there will not be consequences. Madam Speaker, I'm sure there are any number of PhDs out there who will somehow refute that there is a correlation between this aggressive assault of images before us, constantly before us, and the recurring violence that is all around us. Instead, we want simple answers and quick fixes, and then we'll just move on. I suggest that we look inward to regain a deeper understanding of what it means to be in community, in a common bond with neighbors, where persons are not in isolation, where check mechanisms are so ordinary that persons are not simply roaming around disconnected from communities of concern, family life, mental health treatment, or swift enforcement action, whatever is needed. A single and simple policy response from Washington cannot fix this. We all want to have a more caring and supportive society, but the fragmentation of family, civic, and our nation's community life lends itself to isolation, anger, and for some, even despair. Now, let's be clear, this tragedy is the result of a deeply disturbed person who committed unspeakable crimes. That is where the blame rests. But perhaps, Madam Speaker, but perhaps, an outcome deserving of these children who died is that we all take some responsibility for the degradation of culture, what we think about, the way we conduct ourselves, and perhaps strive for that which is noble, that which is good, and that which is just. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Under the Speaker's announced policies of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Bartlett, is recognized for 32 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to echo the concerns of my colleague. We are changed. We are affected by what we see, by what we hear, by what we listen to, by what we watch. You cannot swim in a sea of violence and not be affected by it. I know we have a Constitution and an amendment which guarantees freedom of speech, but you don't have a right to do what is wrong. And it is wrong that our entertainment media is placing before particularly our impressionable young people these unending scenes of violence in these video games. You know, whenever the unbridled expression of one right infringes on another, we limit that right. You do have a right of freedom of speech, but still you can't yell fire, fire in a crowded theater if there is no fire, because people could get hurt in trying to get out. That same philosophy, I think, would permit us to limit the kinds of entertainment and the violence that pervades our society. I know there are many factors to what caused this tragedy, but certainly this could be one of them, particularly to people who don't have all of the faculties that the average of us have for contending with the changes in our environment. I'd like also to refer back to comments that my good friend Dan Burton made, that so little is known about us here. We kind of appear here, Madam Speaker, almost as if we were the products of spontaneous generation, and there we are in front of the microphone, and a million and a half people out there are watching us. Just who are we? So I thought I might spend just a moment doing what I probably should have done 20 years ago and kind of introduce myself. I was born in 1926. If you're doing some quick math, yeah, that means I'm in my 87th year. Our family hardly knew that there was a Great Depression. We were just as poor before the Depression as we were during the Depression. I was the first member of my immediate family to graduate from college. I wanted to be a medical missionary, and so I was studying theology, and I was taking science courses so that I could go to med school. And I had a really, really good science teacher, and I took all the courses he offered and enough more so that when I graduated from college, I not only had a degree and a major in a Bible and a minor in homiletics. That's a degree in theology. But I also had a major in biology and a minor in chemistry, and I had decided not to go to medical school, and I wanted to go into the ministry, but I was 21 years old, and I looked 17, and I wasn't married, and you don't have a big, immediate, bright future in the ministry looking 17 and not being married, and so they advised me to occupy until I got older and got married, and I went to the graduate school, and I got a master's and a doctorate and committed myself to being a very serious basic researcher. I taught medical school for 4 years. I worked at the National Institutes of Health. I went to a lot of professional scientific meetings. I have about 50 papers in the basic scientific literature. And then I had kind of a strange twist to my career when I went as a basic researcher to the School of Aviation Medicine in Pensacola, Florida. They had some problems that I thought that I could solve. I was a farm boy. I live on a farm now. I've always lived on a farm. You kind of learn to make do, and I thought I could fix some of the problems they had. And that resulted in the awards of 19 military patents as a result of fixing some of those problems that they had. Then started a career of working for 20 years for the military. I should mention that I returned to my basic first love, and that was teaching, and I taught for another 20 years. And also, my wife and I ran a home construction business. Congressman Ben Cardin said that Roscoe was green before it was cool to be green, and I was building solar houses back in the late 70s and the early 80s and selling them, I remember, at as much as 17% interest. And then I was retired for 5 years, and I ran for Congress, and I'll tell you, there's nothing that I have done that has given me the fulfillment and the satisfaction as serving the constituents of the 6th District of Maryland. For 20 consecutive elections, 10 primaries and 10 general elections, they returned me to the Congress. I want to thank my constituents very much for that vote of confidence. And that was really largely due to the fact that I had such an incredible staff that did a really good job of making me look good in spite of all of my limitations and frailties. Most of my commitment to Congress has been in the Armed Services Committee. You can only have one chairmanship here, and for the last dozen years or so, those chairmanships have been in armed services. I shared leadership of one of those subcommittees, the one that has responsibility for the Navy and the Marine Corps, with my good friend Gene Taylor from Mississippi. I was his chair for 4 years, and then he was my chair when we changed leadership here in the Congress for 2 years. We're term limited on our side of the aisle, so I had to leave that subcommittee. But while I was there, Gene and I changed the course of our Navy for the future. In the future, all of our major surface combatants will be nuclear. It didn't make any sense to us that our aircraft carriers, which are nuclear and fueled for 30 years, cannot function without their escort ships, who are fueled for about 5 to 7 days. And if there are no tankers out there to refuel them, our aircraft carriers cannot function. That didn't seem to make any sense to us, and so we pushed and finally got it through. Our future Navy major surface combatants are going to be nuclear. And we also had responsibility for the Marine Corps, as I mentioned, and the IEDs and MRAPs, and I was honored to work with my friend Gene Taylor, and we shepherded the MRAPs and its development. $47 billion. It saved a lot of lives in the most asymmetric war in the history of the world. I thought I might spend the few moments that remain and kind of looking back at those times that I've come to the floor. I came here to talk about 4 different things, and I thought I might spend, that is in special orders, I might spend just a few moments talking about those things. Probably got more calls in our office about a talk that I've given here probably 4 or 5 times. I called it What Made America Great. And what I was trying to do is to go back, to look at our history, to refute 2 big lies that are out there in our land. One of those is that our founding fathers were largely atheist and deist, and they wanted to set up a country that was devoid of religion. If you look at our history books, of course, that isn't true. And what I did in that talk was simply to go back to our founding fathers and look at their statements. I went back to our early Congress and looked at what they did, like buying 20,000 copies of the Bible to give out to our early constituents, like paying for missionaries to go to the American Indians for 100 years. Our Congress did that, and then I looked at our Supreme Court. Then until they made that big decision about 3/4 through the history of our young country, they were devoutly supportive of religion. A case came to the Supreme Court about using the Bible in schools. They said, why shouldn't you use the Bible in our schools? Where else can you find so clear a definition of what is right and what is wrong? And then I went to our schools, and the McGuffey Reader. Some of our schools went back to that because we were graduating kids from college who couldn't read their own diploma, and so in desperation they looked at, gee, what did work when our kids graduated from school and could read, and the McGuffey Reader was one of those. And he makes no apology. He quoted more often from the Bible than any other source. One of our founding fathers was Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin and some others like Thomas Jefferson were said to be deists. Now, what is a deist? A deist is someone who believes there is a God. They believe he created you. But he also set in motion some laws, and don't bother praying to him because your destiny is going to be determined by how you relate to those laws. I'm going to give a quote, not an exact quote, but pretty close to what Benjamin Franklin said, and let you decide if you think he was a deist or not. It was in Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention was deadlocked. They might not get a constitution. Benjamin Franklin, I believe, was the oldest member of that delegation, probably the most respected governor of Pennsylvania. And he rose to speak, and this is what he said. I'm an old man. I've lived a long time. And the longer I live, the more certain I am that God controls in the affairs of men. If a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, can a nation rise without his aid? And then he went on to say, I move that henceforth we begin each of our meetings with prayer. That started a precedent. I know that the 10 Commandments are coming down from the walls of the courthouse, and I know that the nativity scene is disappearing from the public square. But you still see it here. In God we trust. And we begin each of our meetings here with prayer, and they do the same thing in the Senate and the other side of this building. We probably got more responses in our office to that talk, What Made America Great. And it's easy to refute those 2 great lies. Our founding fathers were Christians. They wanted to set up a Christian nation, and that First Amendment is very simple. Very simple. It's, you know, they came here, most of our founding fathers came here to escape 2 tyrannies. the tyranny of the church and the tyranny of the crown. If you think about it, they all came from countries that had a king or an emperor, and so there was a tyranny of the crown. If you also think about it, they came from countries where there was a state church. In England, it was the Episcopal Church. On the continent, it was a Roman church. And those churches could and did oppress other religions, so they came here and they didn't want that to happen in their country. And so they said something very simple and very straightforward in that person. Make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The state cannot establish a religion. Otherwise, leave men free to worship as they please. I have no idea how that's gotten warped into this idea that you can't be religious, that government has to be totally separated from religion. By the way, that clause is in a constitution. The separation of church and state, it's in the Constitution of the USSR. It's not in our Constitution. Well, the second thing I came here to the floor to talk about when the debate was raging was ethical embryonic stem cell procurement. Remember when George Bush came to office, there was a lot of research in stem cells. And we'd been using adult stem cells, but experts in the area, I'm probably the only member of Congress who has had a degree in advanced embryology, and so I knew a little about embryonic stem cells. And the experts all believe that there ought to be more usefulness of embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells simply because they're totipotent. They will develop into anything and everything in the body. When you get to an adult stem cell that's already kind of differentiated and you're somewhat limited in what you can do with it. But to get these embryonic stem cells, they were destroying the embryo. Now, every year there's something like 40,000 embryos that are just discarded because the owners don't want them anymore and they won't pay for keeping them. They're frozen in liquid nitrogen, and so they're discarded. And the argument was, gee, you can take one of these discarded embryos and it's going to be discarded anyhow, and you can crush it, you get the stem cells from it. But before you do that, you look at it under the microscope, and there you see it. Living tissue. Gee, that might be the next Albert Einstein. When you're talking about them collectively, 40,000, it's easy just to say they're going to be discarded. When you're looking at that one under your microscope, a unique human being, if you just give it the chance to be implanted and to grow in the womb. But I knew that we could get cells from these early embryos and not hurt the embryo. How did I know that? How was I so sure of that? Well, you can take half the cells from an early embryo and it goes on to develop a perfectly good child, infant. How do I know that? Because the other half of those cells went on to produce another perfectly good twin. In every case of twins that you see, identical twins that you see, half of the cells were taken from the embryo, and the other half went on. The chairman of the President's Commission on Ethical Embryonic Stem Cell was an identical twin, and I asked him if he felt any less of a person because he was only half a person, because he was only half the embryonic cell. It's a perfectly silly question, of course, and he said, gee, that is a silly question, isn't it? I said, but that's what people are saying. If you're going to take a cell or two from an early embryo, somehow it's going to be less of a person when it develops. Well, I worked 5 years, nearly 6 years, with the White House, with the Council of Catholic Bishops, with the Right to Life community, and we developed a bill that was passed unanimously in the Senate. And it failed on a technicality in the House. It came up on suspension. It got way more than half the votes, but not 2/3 of the vote. And so Bush gave it the effect of law because he supported it by making it an executive order, and the first executive order of this administration. The hand had hardly come off the Bible when our new president reversed that executive order, had it become law. And people asked me what was the greatest disappointment of my 20 years here, and that was that my bill passed unanimously by the Senate couldn't have become law because it would still be, because you'd have to overcome a veto, and we would not have 2/3 of the votes to do that. Well, the third thing that I came here to the floor to talk about was electromagnetic pulse. And I had no idea when I first learned about this, but I called my friend Tom Clancy because I knew that he had written a book where this was scenario in his book, and he does really good research. And so I asked him about EMP. He said, if you read my book, you know all that I know about it. Let me refer you to the smartest man hired by the U.S. government. That's a tall order because we hire a lot of people, but in his view, that was a Dr. Lowell Wood from Lawrence Livermore, and this was pre-cell phone day. Remember the pagers? And I paged Lowell Wood. He was supposed to be in California. Lawrence Livermore went up to the satellite and down, and he was in Washington, and he got it there, and within an hour he was sitting in my office. Well, an electromagnetic pulse, we have only one brief experience with it in our country, and that was in 1962 in Johnston Island in the Starfish Prime. The only time we ever detonated a weapon above the atmosphere. We had no idea what would happen. It produced an electromagnetic pulse that caused a lot of disturbances in Hawaii, which was about 800 miles away. The Soviets had a lot more experience than we. They actually developed we designed them but never built them, enhanced EMP weapons. A single large nuclear bomb, oh, I shouldn't say that because it doesn't have to be a large bomb because it can be a relatively small bomb that's EMP enhanced. A single appropriate bomb detonated 300 miles high over Nebraska or Iowa would blanket our whole country, and if the EMP laydown was robust enough, it would essentially fry all of our microelectronics. The grid would be down for a year or more, and your car wouldn't run. And there have been a couple of books written on that subject. One I would recommend that's an easy read and a very well-researched book, and I commend Newt Gingrich. He brought the author to my office, and he mentioned this on the campaign trail. Thank you, Newt. This is Bill Forston's book called 1 Second After. And I came to my office one day, and there was a big book on my desk, and there was a handwritten note in it, and it was from a Dr. Lowry. He was retired, a Ph.D. electrical engineer in his hospital room, recovering from cardiac surgery, and he was surfing the television, and he happened on C-SPAN, and I was giving one of the half-dozen talks that I've given on EMP, and he listened to it and got turned on and did a lot of research and wrote a book about 700 pages. I didn't think I could read a novel that long. It was so captivating. I read it, and it's called The Satan Legacy. The Satan was a big SA-18. It was one of the Soviet missiles with 10 nuclear warheads, and the story had one of them missing when they transferred from the Ukraine to Russia. Now we know that several other things could also bring down the grid. Oh, by the way, as a result of my work on EMP, we now have a permanent EMP task force in the Pentagon looking at our preparedness militarily. We have the EMP Commission, which functioned for 4 terms, that is 8 years. They have written classified and unclassified reports, and I would recommend that you get one of their unclassified reports. But now there's several other things that could also bring down the grid. One of those is cyber. This is a whole new warfare that we've been in, and we hardly knew about it, but there it was raging. And an appropriate cyber attack could bring down our grid. And something that will bring down the grid, this is not an if, this is a when. And that's a giant solar storm. The only question is, when will the next one come? And if we are not prepared for it, and we are not now, and if we do not prepare for it, it will bring down the grid. And McClellan, the top person in that part of FERC, sat in my office and said that the grid would be down for 1.5 years to 2 years. That's a very long time to hold your breath. And there's another thing that could bring down the grid, and that is a terrorist attack. If you knew what the important substations were and you knew which insulators to take out, it wouldn't take more than a dozen or so people with a .22 rifle. And I'm told that the grid would come down. Now, why, when the grid goes down, can't you bring it back up? And that's because in all of these instances, there's going to be surges of electricity that blow the major transformers. They simply won't melt down. We have a few spares, but very inadequate number of spares. We don't make them in our country. You just order them. There's none available to order, by the way. You order one, and they will build it for you. And it takes 1 year, 1.5 years to 2 years to build one, and we don't build them in our country. So I'm pleased that my efforts, which started here in the floor talking about EMP, have resulted in a recognition that this is something we really need to deal with. A fourth thing that I came to the floor to talk about, and I will spend the last few minutes of our time here together this evening talking about that, and that is energy. And I've been to the floor, I think, 52 times. And most of those times I came here, I talked for a full hour. I was talking about energy, not just energy generically, but a specific type of energy that is liquid fuels. Because when you're talking about energy, we really do have to separate liquid fuels from the other major carrier of energy. It's not energy, it's the way you carry energy. That's electricity. Because we shouldn't have any deficit of electricity with more nuclear power plants. And yes, they are safe. We've never lost a person operating them. With more wind machines, with more solar, with more microhydro, with more true geothermal. We need another word for these heat pumps that are looking not at the zero cold and trying to heat that up trying to make that colder to heat your house up in the wintertime, or trying to heat up hot air to make your house cooler in the summertime. If you're looking at 50, 60 degrees here, that's a whole lot more efficient. We call that geothermal. Got to have another word for that, because true geothermal is tapping into the molten core of the earth. And that, for all practical purposes, is infinite, and it will be there for a very, very long time. With these sources, we can produce all the electricity that we would like to produce. But that is not true of liquid fuels. They are finite. One of the first people to recognize that, and he was for several years a pariah, and then he became an icon, and his name was M. King Hubbert. And he gave what I think will be recognized as the most important speech of the last century. I believe that speech was the 8th day of May in 1956. And he gave that speech in San Antonio, Texas. He was an oil geologist, and he gave it to a group of oil people. Now, if you look back in your history books, you will find that at that time, we were king of oil. We produced more oil, we used more oil. We're still doing that. We're using more oil than anybody else. And we sold more oil than, exported more oil than any other country in the world. And M. King Hubbert told them something that was just audacious and seemingly ridiculous. He said, notwithstanding the fact that we are so big in oil today, in just 14 years, the United States will reach its maximum oil production. And no matter what you do after that, oil production in the United States will go down. See, how could he make that kind of a prediction? He made it because when he looked at an individual oil field, he saw that the exploitation of that field produced kind of a bell curve, sometimes a little distorted bell curve, but kind of a bell curve. When you first started pumping it, it really came out, and then you reached a peak, and then it was harder and harder to get it out, and finally it tailed off, and you gotten all that you could out of the well. So he rationalized that if he could add up all the little fields in the United States, he could get all the little bell curves, he could get one big bell curve, and when he did that, it reached its maximum in 1970. And so he made that prediction in 1956. Right on schedule, in 1970, we reached our maximum oil production. And no matter what we've done since then, like drilling more oil wells than all the rest of the world put together, for instance, today we produce about half the oil we produced in 1956. The second speech, and I don't know if these two men even knew each other, was given by Hyman Rickover just about a year later. It was the 14th day of May, 1957. It was a speech given in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you can pull this one up. It was lost until a few years ago. Just Google for Rickover and energy speech, and it will come up. I think that you will agree with me that it was probably the most insightful speech of the last century. And in it, he noted that oil is finite. He said in the 8,000 year, I didn't think it was that long, those are his numbers. In the 8,000 year recorded history of man, the age of oil will be but a blip. We're behaving as if it's going to be forever. He called it this golden age. Please Google for Rickover and energy speech and pull it up. I think you'll be fascinated by the speech. One of the things he said in it was how long it lasts is important in only one regard. The longer it lasts, the more time will we have to plan an orderly transition to other sources of energy. That's not quite what we're doing. And I'm not sure that he would agree that baby drill, is an orderly transition to other sources of energy. I have just two charts of the probably 100 or more charts that I've used from time to time in talking about this subject, and the subject is peak oil. Let me show you these two charts. This is a chart from, it ends at 2008, and it has the oil production as followed by the two major entities in the world that have the most credibility in this, the EIA, the Energy Information Administration in our country, and the IEA, the International Energy Association, which is a creature of the OECD in Europe. And these were their two curves. And you see they're leveling out up there. And the headline they put in was, peak oil, are we there yet? And I want to show you one other chart. And you cannot find these curves anymore. They were kind of disquieting, and they're taken down from the website. These are the curves of put up by the IEA, International Energy Association. Here we're following the production of oil. You could go back here way, way back for 100 years. Kept producing. Every time we needed more, we could produce more oil. Oh, the different colors here. Natural gas liquids on top, they have that growing, that will grow. Non-conventional oil, that's like from the oil shales, that is growing, that will grow. The dark red there really should be a part of the blue down here. It's just enhanced oil recovery, squeezing a little more out of the fields we're pumping from, like putting live steam down there and CO2 and so forth to force it out. And that this is the fields we're now pumping. And they are admitting that we are reaching peak oil plateau here because they have them tailing off. Now this chart was done in 2008, and the one below it was done in 2010. I'll come to that in just a moment. In order to keep the total liquids going up, you notice what they've done is projected two huge fields here. That by 2030, they said fully a fourth of all the liquids we're getting, only a fourth of it will come from the fields we're now pumping, that 3/4 of it will come from something else. And half of that, half of the total, is going to be from fields that we're not getting anything from now. That's a pretty tall order. Then in 10, they did this other curve down here. And they've reversed the two on top here in different colors, but they're the same thing. And they've included the dark red here down with the oil fields that we're now pumping. And notice, this goes to 35. Oh, up here, by the way, they were going to peak at 112 million barrels a day. We're now we've been stuck at, right here. Here we're stuck, 84 million barrels a day for 5 years. They have it going up to 112. 2 years later, reality is setting in. Now it goes up to only 96. And they go out 5 years further to 2035. Notice a precipitous drop-off in the fields that we're now pumping. Now we have some irrational exuberance, Alan Greenspan would define it in our country, about our ability to get some additional gas and oil out of things like the Marcellus shales and the fields out in the west by horizontal drilling and fracking. And what we're doing, these are represented in these two curves here. I think that one can say in analyzing history with considerable confidence that these two wedges here will not occur. We have in our country now, because we have this additional flow. By the way, it's 600,000. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 600,000 barrels. We use 84 million barrels a day. In 11 or 12 days, the world uses 1 billion barrels of oil. So we're getting 600,000 from the Bakken oil fields out in the west. That's almost literally a drop in the bucket, isn't it? I'd just like to close this last chance probably that I have to come and chat with you here on the floor. It's been a huge honor to represent 660,000 people in the 1st District of Maryland, to come here to the Congress to talk to maybe 1 million and 1.5 million people listening to us out there. Thank you, constituents, for this honor. Thank you for listening. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, for 30 minutes.
Real quick.
Gentlewoman may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to also thank the Democratic leader and leadership for giving us the opportunity to come to the floor as a Congressional Black Caucus. Perhaps some other members may be joining us, but we wanted to just add our word of sympathy and condolences to the families in Newton, Connecticut. We will all grieve for a very, very long time, and rightly so, the loss of the 20 innocent little children and 7 adults who lost their lives in an utterly senseless and horrific act of violence. The people of the Virgin Islands, like the rest of our nation, and indeed the world, mourn the loss of the 27 people gunned down in Newton, Connecticut last week, and our thoughts and prayers are with their families and the entire town, and they will continue to be for a very long time. Our hearts especially go out to them throughout what we know will be an extremely difficult Christmas season. The President and many others have reminded us that we have been here far too many times, even in just this year. As he said at the ecumenical service a few evenings ago, it's time to act. It's not enough to sympathize with the families who lost loved ones. We have to take action to protect our children and to protect all of our citizens. To that extent, I've signed on to the Large Capacity Ammunition Feeding Device Act, sponsored by Congresswomen McCarthy and DeGette, which would prohibit the transport or import of large capacity ammunition feeding devices manufactured before the date of enactment, as well as 4 or 5 other bills sponsored by Congresswoman Maloney, McCarthy, Congressman Perlmutter, and others to improve background checks, to slow the trafficking of guns, and to keep them out of the hands of individuals who should not have them, as well as the Promise Act, which is a prevention bill. But I'm joined this evening by Congresswoman Yvette Clarke of Brooklyn, New York, who has long been an advocate for ending the gun violence in our communities and providing the kinds of assistance, both in intervention and prevention, that we need in so many communities around this country. And she's been a leader on so many issues, and I'd like to yield her such time as she might consume.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Madam Speaker, I've joined my colleague, Dr. Donna Christensen, representative of the Virgin Islands, here tonight in remembrance of the 20 first grade children and 6 educators who were mercilessly gunned down last Friday at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, innocent victims of senseless gun violence. To the families, educators, and the community of Newtown, Connecticut, on behalf of the people of the 11th Congressional District of Brooklyn, New York, I wish to express my most profound and deepest condolences. I believe, like so many across this nation, that the families of these victims, the families of children in every community in the United States, have some very important questions for members of Congress. I also believe that as their representatives, we have an obligation to provide them with answers. Question: why? Why have we allowed our communities around this nation, from a supermarket in Tucson, Arizona, to a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, to a shopping mall in Oregon, to an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, to the streets of Brooklyn, New York? Why have we been so reluctant in protecting them? Why have we left them unprotected, vulnerable to gun violence, death, and the terror that such actions inflict? Who will speak for the people whose lives were cut short, struck down, maimed, and traumatized for life? When will we realize that these incidents are not inevitable, that we have the ability to prevent gun violence and an obligation to do everything in our power to make gun violence a thing of the past? The answer to these questions will define this generation of members of Congress. Our answers will determine the future of our civil society. Americans have the right to demand answers from this Congress. We have the authority to keep the guns away from the streets of our cities and towns. In the 11th Congressional District, which I represent in New York City, the New York City Police Department reported 274 victims from 226 incidents involving gun violence. And that was in 2 neighborhoods in the district that I represent. The majority of these crimes were registered in just 2 communities. 274 victims from 226 incidents. Now, fortunately, not everyone perished in these incidents, but one incident of death is one too many. And the repercussions of the trauma that comes from those who witness these incidents, who dodge the bullets in our communities, is immeasurable. We have the authority to focus our efforts on penalties for gun trafficking and unlawful sales of firearms. We have the authority to prevent the retail sale of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines or clips that are designed for military combat use. And we have the ability to register handguns and microstamp munitions to trace ownership and origin. We have the authority. We only need to have the courage to act. The Newtown tragedy has highlighted a vexing issue that we as Americans must address. It is imperative that we set aside our differences in the 113th Congress to pass legislation that will increase accountability among gun vendors and owners, support local law enforcement to stem the tide of gun trafficking across our nation, reduce the number of illegal guns on our streets, and remove access to high-powered militarized weapons and ammunition which have no place in our communities. Madam Speaker, this is not a Republican problem. It is not a Democrat problem. This is an American problem. And this is a problem we must have the courage to address. I want to thank my colleague for yielding. As I drove up to the Capitol for this special order this evening, I reflected on the flags waving half-mast over the Capitol, an indication of the deep grief and sorrow that our nation faces at this time. I think to my own community where I've attended far too many funerals of families that have been devastated by the heinous act of gun violence. And I think about a former colleague of mine. As a member of the New York City Council, I unfortunately count myself among the victims who witnessed my own city council colleague being gunned down before us. And so what we need to understand is that while these incidents may seem remote from many families, the implications of what can happen in our communities extend beyond what we may hear in the news, but affect tens of thousands who may not have been the immediate or intended target of gun violence, but have been a witness, have been family members, community members that have a love and a care for the lost ones who were taken senselessly and needlessly. Let us muster up the courage to act. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark, for joining us. And again, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for those words that you've uttered on behalf of our communities and the community of Newton and children and our citizens across this country. And flags are flying at half-mast across this country. I know whenever I would drive at home last weekend and I would see them, our thoughts and our hearts went out to the people of Newton, because we knew that that was why they were that way. And like my colleague, I recall going to funerals with my children, something that I never had to do, funerals of their friends. In his column just a few days ago, Nicholas Kristof quoted David Hemingway, a public health specialist at Harvard, who reported that children 5 to 14 in America are 13 times more likely to be murdered with guns as children in other industrialized countries. And that ought to be a call to action to all of us. He wrote, and I agree, let's treat firearms rationally as a center of a public health crisis that claims one life every 20 minutes. If only for the sake of our children, we have to act. And it really needs to begin with renewing the ban on assault weapons. The homicide rate in the United States is 6.9 points higher than rates in 22 other populous high-income countries combined. This gives me great pause when I think that the homicide rate in our neighboring Puerto Rico is more than 4 times higher than that of the U.S., and the Virgin Islands rate is even higher than that compared to the United States overall. The last reported in Puerto Rico was 36.2 per 100,000, and the Virgin Islands is closer to 60. We, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, have been pleading for more federal help, and we can begin with passing the assault ban next year and the other related bills. The United States has the highest rate of gun ownership in the world, an average of 88 per 100 people. I understand that the next highest is Yemen, somewhere around 56 per 100 people. But the rate of gun ownership doesn't always directly relate to the number of homicides. Honduras, with the most homicides by firearm at 68.43 per 100,000, has only 6.2 firearms per 100 people compared to our 88. While Finland, which has a relatively high one, 45.3 guns per 100 people, only reports about 19 per 100,000 homicides by firearm. So while we must do what is required to reduce guns in our community, assault weapons in particular, in this country, there's much more work that has to be done. As Attorney General Holder said earlier this week, and I'm quoting him here, as a nation, I think we have to ask ourselves some hard questions. We need to discuss who we are as a nation. Talk about the freedoms that we have, the rights that we have, and how those might be used in a responsible way. End of quote. And I recently wrote to my fellow Virgin Islanders, as we looked at ours being one of the highest homicide rates in the nation. I also think we need to go further and examine what we have been doing or what we have not been doing in our territory and across our nation that has created an atmosphere where gun violence is escalating to a frightening and totally unacceptable level. And where, in many districts, gun violence has turned, and my district has turned against law enforcement. 6 officers have been injured by gunfire this year in the Virgin Islands. 1, Colvin Georges, died as a result of his injuries. And communities across this country are experiencing the same thing. I know that many feel that guns are needed for their and their families' protection, but keeping a firearm, the reports show that keeping a firearm in a home increases the risk of homicide by a factor of 3. And on the whole, guns are more likely to raise the risk of injury than confer protection. The killings in Newton, in Aurora, and other places are horrific mass killings by disturbed people, and we need to find a way to prevent them from getting access to any kind of firearm. but gun violence is happening every week in neighborhoods across our country, and these too demand our attention, including gang-related gun violence. Gang violence is a growing epidemic across this country. Congress has to work toward passing and funding legislation like the Youth Promise Act, which helps communities facing the greatest youth gang and crime challenges to help those communities to develop a comprehensive response to youth violence through a coordinated prevention and intervention response. And to go back to where we are in the United States compared to other countries, data compiled by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime confirms Americans are living with greater risk of gun-related death than residents of other developed countries. From 2007 to 2009, the U.S. averaged 10,987 homicides per year by firearm, compared with an average of 182 in Germany. Ours was 10,987, compared with an average of 182 in Germany, 75 in Spain, and 47 in the United Kingdom. Mexico, though, averaged about 5,980 annual homicides, still half of ours by firearm during that same period. Colombia was higher. Rosanna Ander, Executive Director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, has said that the U.S. is an outlier, and it is, in lethal violence among developed countries. Other countries have similar rates of rape and battery, Anders said, but because so much American violence includes guns, the rate of death is so much higher. The steady gun violence leaves especially young blacks and Latino men particularly vulnerable and more likely to die in a shooting, federal data shows. Each year, from 2006 to 2010, homicide was the leading cause of death for African American males ages 15 to 24, more than the next 9 causes of death combined, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Persistent gun violence is a part of a complex cycle born of poverty and residential segregation, as is poor health and substandard education, which all are related to the poverty and the persistent gun violence, challenges that the nation has yet to truly face and address. That's what Sampson said, and I agree. And he also says, guns are readily available. Gun violence thrives in part because exposure to violence makes children more likely to engage in violence themselves. It makes them have difficulty learning and therefore climbing the economic ladder. So we can make a big difference. But to make that difference, we have to have the political will. We have to be able to stand up to the NRA, which has gone silent in the face of this tragedy, and other organizations that have blocked us from doing what we know in our hearts is the right thing to do. It is our responsibility, as Congresswoman Clark said, to do what we must to protect our children and to protect the other our other citizens. President Obama has set up a task force, which will be headed by Vice President Joe Biden. He's calling on us to ban military-style assault weapons, to ensure that background checks are there for all gun purchases, and to make access to mental health services at least as easy to access as it is to access guns. I would hope that we would not see the partisanship or the brinkmanship that we are seeing right now in the so-called fiscal cliff, on this fiscal cliff issue, and that we will all work with our Vice President and our President to truly memorialize the children that are being laid to rest this week and not have them be martyrs to our inaction. And with that, Madam Speaker, if I have no further, oh, I have a further speaker, and I would love to yield to our Congressman from Louisiana, and I'm sure that he will add a lot to this discussion. I talked about the fact that African American and Latino males have high rates of death due to gun violence, and one report goes back to 2004, rates Louisiana #2. So I'll yield such time as he might consume to the gentleman from Louisiana, Cedric Richmond.
And I thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for yielding and commend her on her passion as a physician and someone who has taken an oath to preserve life and to make sure that people can live out their years in a meaningful way and die of natural causes. I will just say that I'm from Louisiana, which our motto is we're the sportsman's paradise. We like to fish, we like to hunt. We like to have a fishing pole, and we like to have a gun. But the difference is that the guns we use and the guns that sportsmen use are rifles. And you don't need high-capacity magazines in order to hunt deer, to hunt dove, to hunt ducks, to hunt rabbit. You just don't do that. But I rise tonight in support of my colleagues because, especially in our urban cities, we are losing far too many of our children, our fathers, our mothers, our sisters, and our brothers to gun violence. And every once in a while, we will have an event that will shake the confidence of our country and make us take a step back and rationally look at our gun laws in this country and say, wait, we've done far too much. We've expanded the Second Amendment too far. The founders of the Constitution, when the Second Amendment was crafted, had no idea that we would have AK-47s with clips that can hold 50 rounds. I can just tell you about an incident in Laplace, Louisiana, about 6 months ago, where a gentleman was denied benefits at an office and decided he was going to his car and he was going to go back inside. And one of those good Samaritans, an older lady, called the police and said there's a man armoring up in his car. State police and our sheriffs responded to it and found the man in his car. But when they found him, he had more ammunition in his trunk than state police and our sheriffs put together. He had an AK-47, another rifle, and so much ammunition. But the scary part to that story, and why this Good Samaritan was so key, because when they arrested him, they went to his apartment and he had a suicide note there in his trailer. He had every intention of making sure that he could go in there and kill as many people as he could, even if it meant him dying. When the thugs and the criminals have more guns and more ammunition than our first responders, then we have a problem. And in urban cities, when our kids have better access to guns than textbooks, then we're a country that went wrong. So we're not talking about every American's basic right to bear arms, because that is sacred, it's in our Constitution, and I believe in it. But when we start talking about assault weapons with high-capacity magazines, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction. If you look at Newton, if you look at Aurora, and you look around our country at the incidents that have happened, these are not incidents where one or two people lose their life. If we tally the number of people in the United States that die because of gun violence, if another country entered our soil and did that to us, we would declare war. And we would go out and find those people responsible. But here in the United States, we have taken the Second Amendment to protect things that are just indefensible. So I will join with my colleagues, and I will say when I was in the Louisiana State Legislature, I authored almost every year I was there an assault weapons ban, a bill to close the gun show loopholes, to have a gun registry. And I'm not suggesting here today that we do everything I did in the state legislature, because some things went very, very far. But what I am challenging America to do, and that's to challenge the NRA, the liberals, the gun control lobby, whatever you want to call them, we should all come together in the name of the citizens of the United States that we've lost and have an adult conversation about, can we do better? Because we can. We don't need clips that allow people to take out a whole neighborhood. We don't need guns that you can shoot through police vests and through the police car door and through their shield and hit their body, sold in our sporting goods stores in this country. So at some point, we have to come together. We can't just come together and pray and mourn. People are tired of mourning, and people are not fed up But people are giving up on prayer when you see incidents, when you have to bury your children, when you drop a child off at school and you expect to go there that afternoon and pick them up and talk about what they learned today and do they need help with their homework. You never imagine that you're going to go there and find your child deceased with multiple gunshot wounds because of assault rifles with high-capacity clips. So I will close and thank my colleagues, but where's the United States of America? Always in search of a more perfect union. We can do better. We have to do better. And I will close with my own little paraphrase from a song, and it's to the members of Congress. And we had an incident that shed light on this earlier in our term, in which our colleague was a victim of gun violence. We should be careful of what we do, because the life we save may be our own. And with that, Madam Speaker, I will yield the remaining time back to the physician and the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Congressman Richmond. And the three of us have been here on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus to add our voices to those across our nation who